The purpose of this presentation is to show how many recent theories were wrong. I will primarily use excerpts from a presentation given by Michael Crichton.
Michael Crichton himself is widely regarded as the father of the techno-thriller. He's the author of 21 books, some of which I just mentioned. His books have sold more than 150 million copies, translated into 36 languages, with 12 made into films. He's the recipient of an Emmy, a Peabody, Writers Guild of America Award for the TV series ER. Dr. Crichton is a graduate of Harvard Medical School and has been a visiting lecturer in anthropology at Cambridge University, Henry Russell Shaw Traveling Fellow, postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences, and visiting writer at MIT. Michael has challenged and thrilled people worldwide with his insights and creativity, and his devotion to truth-seeking regarding scientific matters is our topic this evening. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Crichton.
Some of you know that I've written a book that many people find controversial called State of Fear. And I want to tell you how I came to write it. Because up until about 5 years ago, I had very conventional ideas about the environment and the environmental movement. This book really began in 1998 when I had decided to write a novel about a global disaster. That was one of the first books I'd written, and I thought, well, I'm old now, I'll write another one. And in the course of my preparation for this book, I rather casually reviewed what had happened in Chernobyl, because I regarded Chernobyl as the largest man-made disaster that I knew about. What I discovered stunned me. Chernobyl was a tragic event, but nothing remotely close to the global catastrophe that I was imagining. About 50 people had died in Chernobyl, roughly the number of Americans that die every day in traffic accidents. I don't mean to be gruesome, but it was a setback for me. You can't write a novel about a global disaster in which only 50 people die. I was undaunted. I began to research other kinds of disasters that might fulfill my novelistic requirements. And that's when I began to realize how big our planet really is and how resilient its systems ordinarily seem to be. Even though I wanted to create a fictional catastrophe of global proportions, I found it hard to come up with a credible example. I couldn't actually come up with anything that I would believe. So in the end, I set the book aside and wrote something else. But the shock that I had experienced reverberated in me for a while, because what I'd been led to believe about Chernobyl was not merely wrong, it was astonishingly wrong. Let's review that for a minute. These are the low estimates of immediate Chernobyl deaths as a consequence of the actual incident. And you see here the UPI in 1986, at the time of the disaster, predicted that there would be 2,000 immediate deaths. The New York Post thought there would be 16,000. The Canadian Broadcasting Company in 91 thought there would be that many. And you see that the New York Times in 2002 predicting at the low end 15,000 deaths. Their estimates were 15,000 to 30,000 deaths. Now, there was a UN commission in 2000 that suggested that the catastrophe was nowhere near that proportion. And as you can see, the next UN commission in 2005 doesn't really show up on the graph because the total numbers are 56. To report that 15 to 30,000 people are dead when the actual number is 56 represents a very large error. To get some idea of just how big, let's imagine that we lined all the victims up in a row. If 56 people are each represented by 1 foot of space, then that's probably the distance from me to about this second table here, something like that. 15,000 people is 3 miles away. It seems difficult to make a mistake of that scale. But of course, you're probably thinking we're talking about radiation, but about long-term consequences. Unfortunately for the media, their reports are even less accurate here. Here you see CNN in 1996 was predicting future Chernobyl-related illnesses and death in a large swath that would go from Sweden to the Baltic, to the Black Sea, estimating 3.5 million. The BBC, much more conservatively, estimated 50,000. Agence Presse thought 500,000. The Ukrainian Victims Group in 2002 estimated 150,000. The UN Commission in 2005 decided that there would be about 4,000. That's the number of Americans who die of adverse drug reactions in this country every 6 weeks. Again, a huge error. But most troubling of all, according to the UN report, was that the largest public health problem created by the accident was the damaging psychological impact due to a lack of accurate information. This was manifesting, as they said, as negative self-assessments of health, belief in a shortened life expectancy, lack of initiative, and dependency on assistance from the state. In other words, the greatest damage to the people of Chernobyl was caused by bad information. These people weren't blighted by radiation so much as by terrifying but false information. We ought to ponder for a minute exactly what that implies. We demand strict controls on radiation because it's such a health hazard. But clearly, Chernobyl suggests that false information can be a health hazard as damaging as radiation. I'm not saying that radiation is not a threat. I'm also not saying that Chernobyl is not a genuinely serious event. But thousands of Ukrainians who didn't die were made invalids out of fear. They were told to be afraid. They were told they were going to die when they weren't. They were told their children would be deformed when they weren't. They were told they couldn't have children when they could. They were authoritatively promised a future of cancer, deformities, pain, and decay. It's no wonder they responded as they did. In fact, we really need to recognize that this kind of human response is very well documented. Authoritatively telling people they are going to die can in itself be fatal. But once I looked at Chernobyl, I began to remember some other fears in my life that had also never come true. The population bomb, for one. Paul Ehrlich predicted mass starvation in the 1960s. 60 million Americans starving to death. That didn't happen. Other scientists warned of mass species extinctions by the year 2000. Ehrlich himself predicted that half of all species would become extinct by 2000. That didn't happen. The Club of Rome told us we would run out of raw materials ranging from oil to copper by the 1990s. That didn't happen either. It's no surprise that predictions frequently don't come true, but such big ones, and so many. All my life I worried about the decay of the environment, the tragic loss of species, the collapse of ecosystems. I worried a lot. Poisoned by pesticides, alar in apples, falling sperm counts from endocrine disruptors, cancer from power lines, cancer from saccharin, cancer from cell phones, cancer from computer screens, cancer from food coloring, hairspray, electric razors, electric blankets, coffee, chlorinated water. It never seemed to end. Only once, when on the same day I read that beer was a preservative of heart muscle and also a carcinogen, did I begin to realize the bind that I was in. But Chernobyl started me on a new path. When I began to research these old fears to find out what had been said in the past, I discovered several important things. The first is that there's nothing more sobering than a 30-year-old newspaper. You can't figure out what the headlines mean. You don't know who the people are. Theodore Green, John Sparkman, George Reedy, Jack Watson, who were they? You thumb through page after page of vanished concerns, issues that apparently were important at the time and now don't matter at all. It's amazing how many pressing concerns are literally of the moment. They won't matter in 6 months, and certainly not in 6 years. And if they won't matter then, are they really worth our attention now? The second thing I discovered was that attempts to provoke fear tended to employ a certain kind of stereotypic and very intense language. For example, here's a quote on climate. We simply cannot afford to gamble by ignoring it. We cannot risk inaction. Those scientists who say we are merely entering a period of climate instability are acting irresponsibly. The indications are that our climate can soon change for the worse are too strong to be reasonably ignored. Familiar language, isn't it? But this is not actually about global warming. It's about global cooling. Fear of a new ice age. Is anybody here worried about an ice age? Is anybody upset that we didn't act now, back then, to stockpile food and all the other things we were warned that we had to do? Here's a quote from a famous computer study in the 1970s that predicted a dire future for mankind unless we act now. And just notice the language here. We're unanimously convinced that rapid, radical redressment of the present unbalanced and dangerously deteriorating world situation is the primary task facing mankind. Concerted international measures and joint long-term planning will be necessary on a scale and scope without precedent. This supreme effort is founded on a basic change of values and goals at individual, national, and world levels. Very heavy stuff. Here's Paul Ehrlich talking about what he thinks we're going to have to do. He's talking about population. As you know, he favored voluntary controls, but if voluntary controls didn't work, he favored coercive controls. He said the operation will demand many apparently brutal and heartless decisions. The pain may be intense, but the disease is so far advanced that only with radical surgery does the patient have a chance of survival. Here's the UN. This is about Y2K. History offers no example of a parallel threat on a global, national, or local scale. To wait and see invites disaster. A worldwide strategic mobilization similar to the effort required by World War II must be developed in the weeks ahead. Now, nearly everybody's forgotten about Y2K, so let me remind you of what was predicted 6 years ago. Here's one author who said he was assuming at least a 12-month disruption of basic goods and services, including no electrical power, no clean water, no telecommunications, shortages of food, gas, clothing, and retail goods, bank failures, inaccessibility of funds, stock market crash, dramatic drop in real estate prices, economic depression, unemployment, civil unrest, including protests, riots, and general lawlessness. This is actually one of the milder predictions. Here's another prediction that simply pointed to a meltdown of civilization as we know it. Can't get any stronger than that. But what actually happened? Essentially nothing. And one other thing, we have to not be afraid. Fear may produce a television audience, it may generate cash for an advocacy group, but fear paralyzes us, it freezes us. And we really need to put that behind us as we move into a new era of managing complexity. Because, look, here's the Independent, the future of the Earth. Is this the end of the world? Earthquakes, hurricanes, floods. What is happening to our planet? Is this the end of the world? No. We live on an active planet. Earthquakes are continuous, 1.5 million a year, or 3 every minute. A Richter 5 every 6 hours. A major quake every 3 weeks. This is all the earthquakes in California in the last week. There's a quake the size of Pakistan every 8 months. This is Kobe in Japan. Despite building codes, the buildings just topple. Very good building. At any moment on our planet, there are 11 lightning strikes every second. There are 1,500 electrical storms on the planet at any moment. A tornado touches down every 6 hours. A tidal wave crosses the Pacific every 3 months. There are 90 hurricanes a year, 1 every 4 days. It's constant. Is this the end of the world? No, this is the world. And I think it's time we knew it. Thank you very much.
President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, had in the cool decade of the 1970s predicted the end of civilization due to a new ice age. He blamed man. Burning fossil fuels was the cause. So we needed to stop burning fossil fuels. The Earth got warmer in the 1980s, so 10 years later, Holdren adopted Al Gore's global warming theory. Gore and Holdren now said the Earth would burn due to man's burning fossil fuels. Notice that man's burning of fossil fuels was the cause of an ice age, and then man's burning fossil fuels was the cause of the Earth's surface burning. Is that plausible? 25 years after Gore made his urgent plea to do something immediately, the Earth is fine. There has been no global warming for 18 years, and the Earth has gotten cooler from the years 2013 to 2017. Thank you for watching. Bob Bryant.